Thank you all for being here. And I'll start by going through some of our global and regional findings and discussing some of the changes on the map behind me. And then, as David said, we'll open it up for questions. So in terms of the global picture this year, of 197 countries assessed during 2011, including the new country of South Sudan, a total of 66, or 33.5%, were rated free, 72, or 36.5%, were rated partly free, and 59, or 30%, were rated not free. And this balance reflects a shift towards the partly free category compared with last year's index. As David mentioned, in terms of population, the figures are much more stark, with only 14.5% of the world's population, or 1 in 6 people, living in countries with a fully free press. The majority live in partly free environments, and then 40.5% live in not free environments. And the percentage of people living in countries with free media in 2011 declined to the lowest level since 1996, when we started tracking population data. So this is continues to be a very worrying trend. In terms of the overall level of press freedom worldwide, as measured by our global average score, this actually improved slightly in 2011, marking the end of an 8-year negative trend. So that's one of the positive things this year. And in terms of regional trends, as David mentioned, driven by the dramatic openings in several countries, there was a significant net improvement in the Middle East and North Africa in terms of the regional average score, with a more modest improvement in the Asia-Pacific region. However, these positive openings were nearly balanced by negative movements in the regional average for Central and Eastern Europe and Eurasia, the Americas, and to a lesser extent in Sub-Saharan Africa. Finally, examining countries with significant numerical shifts, which we define as a shift of more than 3 points on our scale of 0 to 100 points, 2011 was far more balanced than in recent years, with declines in 12 countries only marginally outnumbering gains in 11 countries. In terms of the key trends and developments in 2011, first, the positive news. The Middle East and North Africa saw dramatic, if precarious, gains, with 3 countries, Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia, experiencing improvements as a result of the Arab Spring revolutions. Dramatic gains in press freedom in Tunisia and Libya in particular marked major breakthroughs for countries long governed by autocratic rulers. Outside the region, we saw positive improvements in a number of countries, including Burma, Indonesia, Niger, the Philippines, Thailand, and Zambia. And now turning to the negative news, some of the not so positive things that we saw around the world. Independent media continue to face challenges in a number of environments. For example, regimes in other countries in the Middle East, such as Bahrain and Syria, carried out harsh crackdowns on the media as they struggled to contain their own Arab Spring protest movements. And authoritarian governments elsewhere, fearing domestic unrest, censored news of the Arab uprisings and cracked down on journalists who were covering local anti-government protests. In addition, several important authoritarian states, including China, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, continued to use a variety of techniques to maintain a tight grip on the press, including detaining and jailing critics, maintaining control over the domestic broadcast media, particularly television, closing down independent media outlets, and bringing legal cases against journalists. In addition, various challenges continue to affect free media in a number of democratic countries, including India, Israel, Italy, Hungary, South Africa, and South Korea. And we also noted substantial deterioration in a number of partly free media environments, including Ecuador, Macedonia, Malawi, Uganda, and Ukraine. Next, turning to the changes on the map behind me, I'll discuss the status changes for this year. We had a total of 10 status changes, 4 negative and 6 positive, with most representing improvements from the not free to the partly free category. There were 3 countries that moved this year from free to partly free. First, we had Chile, whose score moved from 29 to 31 points due to harassment, detention, and attacks against visual media journalists attempting to cover protests and strikes during 2011. Also, there was a small bomb that exploded outside the offices of a media company, and cyber attacks were launched on news websites. The independent media in Chile remains stifled by an existing ownership duopoly, especially in the print sector. Next, Guyana moved from 30 to 33 points and moved to partly free due to the heightened polarization of the media as well as verbal intimidation of journalists by members of the ruling party leading up to and during the November 2011 general elections. Ongoing libel cases and the passage of a Restricting Broadcast Act dramatically increased fines for broadcasting without a license and also contributed to a more restricted media environment. And finally, in this section, Hungary score moved from 30 to 36 points and moved to partly free to reflect a general decline and a continuation from the decline we saw last year in the Hungarian media environment due to the impact of significant legal and regulatory changes introduced in 2010, including evidence of politically motivated licensing procedures, which resulted in the loss of frequencies for Klub Radio, a major radio network, the establishment of a new National Agency for Data Protection, increased reports of censorship and self-censorship, especially in the public service channels, and worsening economic conditions for independent media entrepreneurship. Also negatively, moving from partly free to not free, we had Guinea, whose score moved from 59 to 62 points due to the failure of the newly elected president to implement reforms enacted in 2010 that had the year before improved the legal environment for press freedom. Further, the regulatory body imposed a brief media blackout after a July assassination attempt on the president, and several media workers were detained, suspended, and threatened by the government and security forces. On the positive side now, moving from not free to partly free, we had 5 countries. Egypt first moved from 65 to 57 points as a result of the flourishing of new independent media outlets, less self-censorship, and some loosening of centralized editorial control over state media after President Hosni Mubarak stepped down in February 2011 after nearly 30 years in power. Libya moved from 94 to 60 points, one of the biggest numerical jumps we've seen in recent years, due to significant improvements in media freedom and access to information as the Gaddafi regime's control over the country progressively crumbled during 2011. The draft constitution does contain provisions for expanded freedom of expression, and access to officials is far greater than under the prior government. There has also been a boom of media outlets, particularly in the east of the country, which has led to much more diversity of viewpoints. Journalists are able to cover the news more freely and with less threat of violence and intimidation, although these do remain issues in Libya, of course. Thailand moved from 62 to 60 points due to the expansion of media coverage leading up to and following the July 2011 elections. In 2011, Thai media saw a general thaw that enabled greater reporting on political issues, expanded space for dissent and coverage of sensitive topics, and a significant decrease in violence against journalists. Following the lapse of the state of emergency at the end of 2010, access for journalists and social media was opened across the country, except for some of the southern regions. Next, Tunisia also had a dramatic numerical improvement from 85 to 51 points to reflect a similar improvement in the media environment following the ouster of the Ben Ali regime in early 2011. The draft constitution contains provisions protecting press freedom, restrictive laws are no longer being used to imprison journalists, and formally tight controls over the internet have been relaxed considerably. A number of private media outlets were registered and began operating, leading to greater diversity of viewpoints and less self-censorship, and as well state control over content. Both professional and citizen journalists were able to cover the news more freely and without less fear of reprisals. Additionally, there were fewer economic barriers to entry in the media market, and outlets were able to more easily sustain their operations through advertising. And finally, Zambia moved from 61 to 60 points due to improvements in the public media initiated by a new government after the September 2011 elections, which has led to greater professionalism and independence, less self-censorship, and a decrease in the overtly partisan character of these media outlets. Finally, moving from partly free to free, we have Tonga, which moved from 31 to 29 points due to a new government's commitment to strengthening press freedom and a general reduction in the harassment and intimidation of journalists. Turning next, I'll focus on what we call the worst of the worst, which are the world's 8 worst-rated countries, which have scores of between 90 to 100 points on our scale. In these states, independent media are either non-existent or barely able to operate. The press acts as a mouthpiece for the regime. Citizens' access to unbiased information is severely limited, and dissent is crushed through imprisonment, torture, and other forms of repression. So these 8 countries this year are Belarus, Cuba, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Iran, North Korea, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Positively, however, during 2011, the number of states where free media remain overwhelmingly circumscribed dropped to its lowest point in the past 5 years, as Burma and Libya moved out of this cohort. And finally, I'd like to end with a note of caution. As we've seen, positively, led by several of the dramatic openings I've mentioned, 2011 saw a reversal of the negative trends we've been noting for the past 8 years. These openings, while still tenuous and far from perfect, are critical for the future of democratic development in general and must be nurtured and protected. However, already we have seen troubling developments in some of these newly open media environments, calling for renewed vigilance and effort to ensure that the gains of 2011 are not reversed in years to come. So thank you very much. Now I'll open it for questions. And apologies in advance if I'm not quite as sharp as I usually am, but I've just returned today from 2 months of maternity leave, so please bear with me as I try and answer questions on any of the countries. Thank you. So any questions? Yeah. Well, that's a very good question. And there were a number of cases this past year where we saw that reporters were, you know, as you said, entering countries over borders or illegally, and in some cases facing, you know, death or serious risks to their personal safety. And it's a difficult question because in many cases it's very difficult to enter these countries. What we saw in Libya, for example, was that journalists who did try and enter through the proper channels were severely restricted in their ability to cover the events. So often, you know, going by legal channels can lead to journalists not being able to cover the news in a fair and unbiased manner. And that is, you know, why many journalists were trying to enter by other means. So I would say that, you know, there are benefits and risks to both sides. You know, many reporters were risking their lives in Libya, in Syria, in a number of other environments. And in many cases, these were the only ways in which people were able to get news and information that was unbiased and was coming out of those countries. For example, in Syria, most of the government-controlled news outlets were really broadcasting a very biased form of the news. So it's very difficult because reporters are putting themselves at huge risk if they are trying to cover these types of stories. But I feel personally that it's very important that these stories get out, and it's tribute to those journalists risking their lives who are trying to cover those types of stories in very, very difficult environments. Yeah.
So you encourage reporters to take that risk, or with other means that are available right now, maybe they should not really risk their lives and try to get some news and report the news through other means?
Well, I think it's essential. Yeah, no, I think it's essential that journalists take every step to protect themselves, including, you know, engaging in safety training. There are many journalistic operations right now and press freedom organizations that do provide that sort of training to journalists. So that's very important that, you know, they try and figure out what they need to do to protect themselves, although in many situations that's almost impossible. In terms of, you know, whether they should be doing that, I mean, I think there may, given the rise of social media and other, as you said, other ways to get information out, I think that's also something that should be explored about whether, you know, they can get news out of the country by other means, except by risking their own personal safety. So I think it's really up to the individual journalists. Obviously, some journalists are willing to take those risks, and some may not be. But it's, you know, there are many journalists killed this year in Syria and Libya, and I think they're going to be up on the museum's wall on the other side of this gallery. But it's a very difficult question. But I think it's really up to the individual journalist to decide what they feel comfortable with.
I'm András from Hungary. What are your future expectations about Europe, actually? Because I think there are some very worrying tendencies beside that you mentioned. So there are some countries that are very worrying tendencies beside Ukraine, Hungary, Macedonia.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious India had a new prime minister who was always very keen on regulating the media. A big German publishing house has just left Serbia. The concentration of the media ownership because of, in one part, the economic crisis can be seen in many countries. So there are some very worrying tendencies in Europe, actually.
Yeah, no, I guess Central and Eastern Europe and parts of the former Soviet Union, which actually had shown huge improvements, obviously following the fall of communism, we've seen backsliding in a number of these environments. And I think what's happening in Hungary is particularly worrying. It's one of the steepest numerical declines that we've seen in a free country in recent years, over the last 2 years. And I think it's a reminder that you really cannot take press freedom for granted, even in very open and free environments. A new government can come into power and really dramatically change the legal and regulatory environment quite quickly if they have a constitutional majority. So we're hoping that what has happened in Hungary is not going to happen in some of the other countries. That's been quite a dramatic change in the last 2 years. But as you mentioned, there are some other worrying trends, particularly concerning the impact of the economic crisis on a number of these countries. We've actually seen declines in the scores for some of the Baltic states and other countries in the region because of this issue. And there are still worrying issues concerning the legal environment in a number of these countries as well. So it is actually one of the regions where we've seen declines over the last few years, and we saw continued decline this year. And we're definitely keeping an eye on it because I think it is a reminder that even after these big openings, even after a lot of money was poured into media development in some of these countries, that you can have backsliding. So it's definitely an area of continued concern for us, and we're hoping that Hungary is not going to be a model for the other countries to follow. Yeah. Yes, no, definitely. I mean, China's an interesting case because they do impose these very strict controls, but people in China and also people outside China are, constantly trying to find ways around them. So we look at those issues in the Press Freedom Report, particularly concerning new media, social media, and other alternative forms of sharing news and information. We also have a separate Internet Freedom Report, which looks at those issues in much more depth. Which really tracks some of those ongoing dynamics. But China presents a very interesting case of a country which is really trying to completely control what's going on the internet and yet finds it impossible to do so. And with the rise of mobile phones, and sort of sharing news and information on alternative platforms, that's becoming even more difficult. So this past year in China, we did see ongoing dynamics in that sphere. There were a number of cases where the authorities were trying to impose news controls, and then citizens were really pushing back and being able to get the news out on a number of different issues. So it's a positive that they are pushing back, but we see the government continuing to repress media quite severely in China. Any other questions? Yeah?
I wanted to get your thoughts on Sub-Saharan Africa, especially Somalia, Eritrea, and Ethiopia, considering the fact that Eritrea has jailed over 100 journalists last year, and Ethiopia has about 11 journalists being tried for terrorism-related charges. I wanted maybe to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I mean, Eritrea is in our bottom 8 countries worldwide, and the media is severely restricted and has been for a number of years, ever since the crackdown in 2001. So conditions in Eritrea are quite hostile. There are no independent media outlets at all, and it's one of the most severely circumscribed countries. Ethiopia was actually one of the countries we highlighted this year as having a significant numerical decline of 3 points. And as you mentioned, one of the main reasons for this was the use of the anti-terrorism law to jail and threaten to harass and imprison a number of critics. So Ethiopia, we've seen negative slide in the last few years in terms of media freedom, where it's becoming increasingly difficult for any independent outlets to operate and criticize the government. And it's quite a worrying trend. Somalia also has a very restricted environment. Obviously, the main issue in Somalia is the level of violence against journalists, where a number of journalists continue to be killed every year, and it's very, very difficult to report the news. So in general, the Horn of Africa is, I would say, one of the darkest spots in Africa in terms of media freedom, if you look at those three countries. And things have only gotten worse in the last few years in those countries. Yeah. Well, North Korea continues to be our worst rated country in the world, and we actually did not see any changes at all in last year. So the score has not changed. We'll see what happens after this change in leadership in 2012, but as far as we could tell so far, there hasn't really been a major shift in the media environment in North Korea, and it's very, very severely circumscribed. In terms of gathering information, it's mostly from news reports, from exile groups, things like that, and from South Korean media as well, who report on the situation. But it is very, very difficult to get information. There was one positive development last year in that the AP opened a news bureau for the first time in North Korea. So whether they'll actually be able to report on what's going on in the country is another issue. But that was one positive step. But I'm not holding my breath. Mm-hmm.
About creation of independent public Russian television.
Mm-hmm.
Could you say a few words? What do you think?
Yeah, no, sure. Well, definitely the media environment in Russia continues to be fairly circumscribed, and it's still rated in our not free category. And as you know, most of the domestic media is, sort of under the control of the government. There are continuing issues regarding violence against journalists and impunity, it's a fairly circumscribed situation, and particularly bad is the situation in the North Caucasus, which we also cover under Russia. However, we did have a 1-point improvement last year in Russia, and that was basically due to the pushback and the coverage by social media, particularly of the elections at the end of the year and some of the protest movements. And it's interesting that one of the things that a lot of the protesters were calling for was the establishment of a sort of unbiased public broadcaster. So that we did see actually some positive move in Russia this past year. It was very marginal, and the situation remains very close, but we do see some hope for some pushback, mostly by the social media. However, the major media outlets, and especially television, still remains completely under state control. But that was definitely a positive thing we saw in Russia this year. Well, when we look at independent media, we basically are trying to assess independence from a variety of sources. So we don't just look at, let's say, if it's a non-state paper, but we look also at, let's say, the private owner or a corporate owner, and if the media outlet is able to exercise independent editorial control. So our survey, in general, does not just look at independence from government, but also independence from owners. And we look at the ability of, let's say, journalists at a news outlet to be able to cover stories without fear of either censorship from the owner, from the editors at the higher levels of the newspaper, or in terms of self-censorship. So we try to assess independence from a variety of sources. Under the economic section of our methodology, we also look, for example, at sustainability of news outlets and whether they are able to sustain themselves through advertising, or whether they're, let's say, dependent on, grants or, infusions of money from other countries or things like that. So we try and assess independence in a number of ways, both in terms of editorial control, also in terms of financing. And it's it's a difficult situation because in some countries media ownership is very transparent, and in some countries it's not. So it is a difficult thing to measure, but we try and look at it from a wide variety of angles. Yes. No, definitely. But because what we see also is that in a number of countries, let's say the government is actually paying, let's say bloggers or other social media activists to cover stories in a certain way. And so you really have to look into a lot of things behind what the outlet is, or even an individual, before you can assess independence. So we definitely try and look at both traditional media as well as blogging and other forms of social media.
Last question.
On Turkey, many people talk about Turkey as a model country for the Arab Spring countries, and we see that it's declining. Can you please comment on that?
Well, I think Turkey may be a model in some ways, but definitely not in terms of media freedom. And I think media freedom and freedom of expression in Turkey is really sort of an outlying case where there's been, as you said, declines in recent years. Turkey now has one of the highest numbers of journalists in prison of any country in the world, which is really an anomaly for a country which is, has democratic elections and has other institutions of democracy in place. So we've seen negative declines in Turkey over the last few years, both in terms of the use of Article 301, the anti-terrorism law, and some of these legal means have been used to imprison a vast number of journalists, many of whom are being held without charge. And that's one of the main issues that we have with Turkey, is that either people should be brought to trial or they should be released. That's basically the major issue in Turkey, is the very restrictive laws and the way they're being used to imprison journalists. So in terms of that, I would say Turkey is definitely not a model for the other Arab Spring countries, and I would hope that other countries in the region do not follow that example.